Introduction Part 1 of Rob Roy. This is LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rowan. Rob Roy by Sir Walter Scott. Volume 1. For why? Because the good old rule sufficeth them. The simple plan, that they should take who have the power, and they should keep who can. Rob Roy's Grave, Wordsworth. Advertisement to the first edition. When the editor of the following volumes published, about 2 years since, the work called Antiquary, he announced that he was, for the last time, intruding upon the public in his present capacity. He might shelter himself under the plea that every anonymous writer is, like the celebrated Junius, only a phantom, and that therefore, although an apparition, of a more benign as well as much meaner description, he cannot be bound to plead to a charge of inconsistency. A better apology may be found in the imitating the confession of honest Benedict, that, when he said he would die a bachelor, he did not think he should live to be married. The best of all would be if, as has eminently happened in the case of some distinguished contemporaries, the merit of the work, in the reader's estimation, form an excuse for the author's breach of promise. Without presuming to hope that this may prove the case, it is only further necessary to mention, that his resolution, like that of Benedict, fell a sacrifice, to temptation at least, if not to stratagem. It is now about 6 months since the author, through the medium of his respectable publishers, received a parcel of papers containing the outlines of this narrative, with a permission, or rather a request, couched in highly flattering terms, that they might be given to the public, with such alterations as should be found suitable. As it may be necessary, in the present edition, 1829, to speak upon the square, the author thinks it proper to own that the communication alluded to is entirely imaginary. These were of course so numerous that, besides the suppression of names and of incidents approaching too much to reality, the work may in a great measure be said to be new written. Several anachronisms have probably crept in during the course of these changes, and the mottos for the chapters have been selected without any reference to the supposed date of the incidents. For these, of course, the editor is responsible. Some others occurred in the original materials, but they are of little consequence. In point of minute accuracy, it may be stated that the bridge over the Forth, or rather the Ivanhoe, or Black River, near the hamlet of Aberfoil, had not an existence 30 years ago. It does not, however, become the editor to be the first to point out these errors, and he takes this public opportunity to thank the unknown and nameless correspondent to whom the reader will owe the principal share of any amusement which he may derive from the following pages. 1st of December 1871. Introduction, 1829. When the author projected this further encroachment on the patience of an indulgent public, he was at some loss for a title, a good name being very nearly of as much consequence in literature as in life. The title of Rob Roy was suggested by the late Mr. Constable, whose sagacity and experience foresaw the germ of popularity which it included. No introduction can be more appropriate to the work than some account of the singular character whose name is given to the title page, and who, through good report and bad report, has maintained a wonderful degree of importance in popular recollection. This cannot be ascribed to the distinction of his birth, which, though that of a gentleman, had in it nothing of high destination, and gave him little right to command in his clan. Neither, though he lived a busy, restless, and enterprising life, were his feats equal to those of other freebooters who have been less distinguished. He owed his fame in great measure to his residing on the very verge of the Highlands, and playing such pranks in the beginning of the 18th century as they usually ascribed to Robin Hood in the Middle Ages, and that, within 40 miles of Glasgow, a great commercial city, the seat of a learned university. Thus a character like his, blending the wild virtues, the subtle policy, and unrestrained license of an American Indian, was flourishing in Scotland during the Augustan age of Queen Anne and George I. Addison, it is probable, or Pope, would have been considerably surprised if they had known that there existed in the same island with them a personage of Rob Roy's peculiar habits and profession. It is this strong contrast betwixt the civilized and cultivated mode of life on the one side of the Highland line, and the wild and lawless adventure which were habitually undertaken and achieved by one who dwelt on the opposite side of that ideal boundary, which creates the interest attracted to his name. Hence it is that even yet, far and near, through vale and hill, are faces that attest the same, and kindle like a fire new stirred at sound of Rob Roy's name. There were several advantages which Rob Roy enjoyed for sustaining to advantage the character which he assumed. The most prominent of these was his descent from, and connection with, the clan MacGregor, so famous for their misfortunes, and the indomitable spirit with which they maintained themselves as a clan, linked and banded together in spite of the most severe laws, executed with unheard of rigour against those who bore this forbidden surname. Their history was that of several other of the original Highland clans, who were suppressed by more powerful neighbours, and either extirpated or forced to secure themselves by renouncing their own family appellation and assuming that of the conquerors. The peculiarity in the story of the MacGregors is their retaining, with such tenacity, their separate existence and union as a clan under circumstances of the utmost urgency. The history of the tribe is briefly as follows, but we must premise that the tale depends in some degree on tradition. Therefore, excepting when written documents are quoted, it must be considered as in some degree dubious. The sept of MacGregor claimed a descent from Gregor or Gregorius, third son, it is said, of Alpin, King of Scots, who flourished about 787. Hence their original patronymic is MacAlpine, and they are usually termed the clan Alpine. An individual tribe of them retains the same name. They are accounted one of the most ancient clans in the Highlands, and it is certain they were a people of original Celtic descent, and occupied at one period very extensive possessions in Perthshire and Argyllshire, which they imprudently continued by the cora glaive, that is, the right of the sword. Their neighbours, the Earl of Argyle and Breadalbane, in the meanwhile, managed to leave the lands occupied by the MacGregors, engrossed in those charters which they easily obtained from the crown, and thus constituted a legal right in their own favour, without much regard to its justice. As opportunity occurred of annoying or extirpating their neighbours, they gradually extended their own domains, by usurping, under the pretext of such royal grants, those of their more uncivilized neighbours. A Sir Duncan Campbell of Lochow, known in the Highlands by the name of Donach Dunan Coraachid, that is, Black Duncan with the cowl, it being his pleasure to wear such a headgear, is said to have been peculiarly successful in those acts of spoliation upon the clan MacGregor. The devoted sept, ever finding themselves iniquitously driven from their possessions, defended themselves by force, and occasionally gained advantage, which they used cruelly enough. This conduct, though natural, considering the country and time, was studiously represented at the capital as arising from an untamable and innate ferocity, which nothing, it was said, could remedy, save cutting off the tribe of MacGregor, root and branch. In an Act of Privy Council at Stirling, 22nd September 1563, in the reign of Queen Mary, commission is granted to the most powerful nobles and chiefs of the clans to pursue the clan Gregor with fire and sword. A similar warrant in 1563, not only grants the like powers to Sir John Campbell of Glenorchy, the descendant of Duncan with the cowl, but discharges the lieges to receive or assist any of the clan Gregor, or afford them, under any colour whatever, meat, drink, or clothes. An atrocity which the clan Gregor committed in 1589 by the murder of John Drummond of Drummond Ernoch, a forester of the royal forest of Glenartney, is elsewhere given, with all its horrid circumstances. The clan swore upon the severed head of the murdered man that they would make common cause in avowing the deed. This led to an act of the Privy Council directing another crusade against the wicked clan Gregor, so long continuing in blood, slaughter, theft, and robbery, in which letters of fire and sword are denounced against them for the space of 3 years. The reader will find this particular fact illustrated in the introduction to the legend of Montrose, in the present edition of these novels. Other occasions frequently occurred in which the MacGregors testified contempt for the laws, from which they had often experienced severity but never protection. Though they were gradually deprived of their possessions, and of all ordinary means of procuring subsistence, they could not, nevertheless, be supposed likely to starve for famine, while they had the means of taking from strangers what they considered as rightfully their own. Hence they became versed in predatory forays and accustomed to bloodshed. Their passions were eager, and, with a little management on the part of some of their most powerful neighbours, they could easily be hounded out, to use an expressive Scottish phrase, to commit violence, of which the wily instigators took the advantage, and left the ignorant MacGregors an undivided portion of blame and punishment. This policy of pushing on the fierce clans of the Highlands and Borders to break the peace of the country is accounted by the historian one of the most dangerous practices of his own period, in which the MacGregors were considered as ready agents. Notwithstanding these severe denunciations, which were acted upon in the same spirit in which they were conceived, some of the clans still possessed property, and the chief of the name in 1592 is designed Alistair MacGregor of Glenstrae. He is said to have been a brave and active man, but, from the tenor of his confession at his death, appears to be engaged in many and desperate feuds, one of which finally proved fatal to himself and many of his followers. This was the celebrated conflict at Glenfruin, near the south-western extremity of Loch Lomond, in the vicinity of which the MacGregors continued to exercise much authority by their cora glaive, or right of the strongest, which we have already mentioned. There had been a long and bloody feud betwixt the MacGregors and the Laird of Luss, head of the family of Colquhoun, a powerful race in the lower part of Loch Lomond. The MacGregors' tradition affirms that the quarrel began on a very trifling subject. Two of the MacGregors being benighted, asked shelter in a house belonging to a dependant of the Colquhouns, and were refused. They then retreated to an outhouse, took a wedder from the fold, killed it, and supped off the carcase, for which, it is said, they offered payment to the proprietor. The Laird of Luss seized on the offenders, and, by the summary process which feudal barons had at their command, had them both condemned and executed. The MacGregors verify this account of the feud by appealing to a proverb current amongst them, execrating the hour Malt thur an cabal gil, that the black wedder with the white tail was ever lambed. To avenge this quarrel, the Laird of MacGregor assembled his clan, to the number of 300 or 400 men, and marched towards Luss from the banks of Loch Long, by a pass called Raid na Gael, or the Highlandman's Pass. Sir Humphrey Colquhoun received early notice of this incursion, and collected a strong force, more than twice the number of that of the invaders. He had with him the gentleman of the name of Buchanan, with the Grahams and other gentry of the Lennox, and a party of the citizens of Dumbarton, under command of Tobias Smollett, a magistrate or baillie of that town, an ancestor of the celebrated author. The parties met in the valley of Glen Fruin, which signifies the Glen of Sorrow, a name that seemed to anticipate the event of the day, which, fatal to the conquered party, was at least equally so to the victors, the babe unborn of Clan Alpine having reason to repent it. The MacGregors, somewhat discouraged by the appearance of a force much superior to their own, were cheered on to the attack by a seer or second-sighted person, who professed that he saw the shrouds of the dead wrapped around their principal opponents. The clan charged with great fury on the front of the enemy, while John MacGregor, with a strong party, made an unexpected attack on the flank. A great part of the Colquhoun's force consisted in cavalry, which could not act in the boggy ground. They were said to have disputed the field manfully, but were at length completely routed, and a merciless slaughter was exercised on the fugitives, of whom betwixt 200 and 300 fell on the field and in the pursuit. If the MacGregors lost, as is averred, only 2 men slain in the action, they had slight provocation for an indiscriminate massacre. It is said that their fury extended itself to a party of students for clerical orders, who had imprudently come to see the battle. Some doubt is thrown on this fact, from the indictment against the chief of the clan Gregor being silent on the subject, as is the historian Johnston, and a Professor Ross, who wrote an account of the battle 29 years after it was fought. It is, however, constantly averred, by the tradition of the country, and a stone where the deed was done is called Lecha Minster, the minster or clerk's flagstone. The MacGregors, by a tradition which is now found to be inaccurate, imputed this cruel action to the ferocity of a single man of their tribe, renowned for size and strength, called Dulgard Kai War, or the Great Mouse-coloured Man. He was MacGregor's foster brother, and the chief committed the youths to his charge, with directions to keep them safely till the affray was over. Whether fearful of their escape, or incensed by some sarcasms which they threw on his tribe, or whether, out of mere thirst of blood, this savage, while the other MacGregors were engaged in the pursuit, poniarded his helpless and defenceless prisoners, when the chieftain, on his return, demanded where the youths were, the Ciar Mhor drew out his bloody dirk, saying in Gaelic, "Ask that, and God save me." The latter words alluded to the exclamation which his victims used when he was murdering them. It would seem, therefore, that this horrible part of the story is founded on fact, though the number of the youths so slain is probably exaggerated in the Lowland accounts. The common people say that the blood of the Ciar Mhor victims can never be washed off the stone. When MacGregor learnt their fate, he expressed the utmost horror at the deed, and upbraided his foster brother with having done that which would occasion the destruction of him and his clan. This supposed homicide was the ancestor of Rob Roy, and the tribe from which he was descended. He lies buried at the church at Fortingal, where his sepulchre, covered with a large stone, is still shown, and where his great strength and courage are the theme of many traditions. MacGregor's brother was one of the very few of the tribe who was slain. He was buried near the field of battle, and the place is marked by a rude stone, called the Grey Stone of MacGregor. Sir Humphrey Colquhoun, being well mounted, escaped for a time to the castle of Bannockburn, or Bennecar. It proved no sure defence, however, for he was shortly after murdered in the vault of the castle. The family annals say, by the MacGregors, though other accounts charge the deeds upon the MacFarlanes. This battle of Glen Fruin, and the severity which the victors exercised in the pursuit, was reported to King James VI. In a manner the most unfavourable to the clan Gregor, whose general character, being that of lawless though brave men, could not much avail them in such a case. That James might fully understand the extent of the slaughter, the widows of the slain, to the number of 11 score, in deep mourning, riding upon white palfreys, and each bearing her husband's bloody shirt on a spear, appeared at Stirling, in presence of a monarch peculiarly accessible to such sights of fear and sorrow, to demand vengeance for the death of their husbands, upon those by whom they had been made desolate. The remedy resorted to was at least as severe as the cruelties which it was designed to punish. By an act of the Privy Council, dated 3rd April 1603, the name of MacGregor was expressly abolished, and those who had hitherto borne it were commanded to change it for other surnames, the pain of death being denounced against those who should call themselves Gregor or MacGregor, the names of their fathers. Under the same penalty, all who had been at the conflict of Glenfruin, or accessory to other marauding parties charged in the act, were prohibited from carrying weapons, except a pointless knife to eat their victuals. By a subsequent Act of Council, 24th June 1613, death was announced against any persons of the tribe formerly called MacGregor, who should presume to assemble in greater numbers than 4. Again, by an Act of Parliament, 1617, chapter 26, these laws were continued and extended to the rising generation, in respect that great numbers of the children of those against whom the Acts of Privy Council had been directed were stated to be then approaching to maturity, who, if permitted to resume the name of their parents, would render the clan as strong as it was before. The execution of those severe acts was chiefly entrusted in the west to the Earl of Argyle and the powerful clan of Campbell, and to the Earl of Athol and his followers in the more eastern Highlands of Perthshire. The MacGregors failed not to resist with the most determined courage, and many a valley in the west and north Highlands retains memory of the severe conflicts, in which the proscribed clans sometimes obtained transient advantages, and always sold their lives dearly. At length the pride of Alistair MacGregor, the chief of the clan, was so much lowered by the sufferings of his people, that he resolved to surrender himself to the Earl of Argyle, with his principal followers, on condition that they should be sent out of Scotland. If the unfortunate chief's own account be true, he had more reasons than one for expecting some favour from the Earl, who had in secret advised and encouraged him to many of the desperate actions for which he was now called to so severe a reckoning. But Argyle, as old Birrell expresses himself, kept a Highlandman's promise with them, fulfilling it to the ear, and breaking it to the sense. MacGregor was sent under a strong guard to the frontier of England, and being thus, in the literal sense, sent out of Scotland, Argyle was judged to have kept faith with him, though the same party which took him there brought him back to Edinburgh in custody. MacGregor of Glanstrey was tried before the Court of Justiciary, 20th of January 1604, and found guilty. He appears to have been instantly conveyed from the bar to the gallows, for Birrell, of the same date, reports that he was hanged at the cross, and, for distinction's sake, was suspended higher by his own height than 2 of his kindred and friends. End of Introduction, Part 1.